Welcome everyone to today's webinar, A Just Recovery for All. My name is Elle Richards and I am hosting your webinar I'm a manager of cities with the Tamarack Institute. We're very pleased to have everyone on board for this really important webinar for today. I have three speakers with me today, Catherine Abreu, Natalie Appleyard, and Maya Menzies. The moderators for today will be Anjem Sultana, so welcome everyone. Catherine is the Executive Director of the Climate Action Network. She's internationally recognized, award-winning campaigner whose work centers on building powerful coalitions to advance transformative action on climate change. Natalie is the socioeconomic policy analyst for Citizens for Public Justice. Natalie uses her background in education to help convene and share knowledge with a variety of stakeholders. Maya is the senior manager of programming and development at the LEAP. She works directly with people mobilizing for change in their communities by crafting stories that make transformative change real. As well, we have Anjem here with us, and she is the National Director of Public Policy, Advocacy, and Strategic Communications for YWCA Canada. Thank you so much for everyone joining us today. Please feel free to drop in questions in the question box. We'll have time for questions, but first we're going to hear from everyone. We'll have some short presentations from everyone. We will start with Catherine, who will provide an overview of the Just Recovery Framework and its involvement of its principles before moving into some examples of how the principles are applied. Anjem will be taking over as our moderator today. We have some questions for the panelists, and then we will open it up for everyone with some questions, and hopefully we can have a rich dialogue. Thank you. So handing it over to you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, and hi everyone. Such a pleasure to be with you all today. I am calling in from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in what is also known as Ottawa. And I am going to open up our conversation by just letting you know about this incredible movement for a just recovery that has been built up over the last number of months. You can visit this movement online at justrecoveryforall.ca. I'm noticing that I missed the V in recovery in my slide here, but remember to fill that in when you check out the website. Just Recovery movement began in the early days of the pandemic. It began with an international call for a just recovery led by organizations like 350, who pulled together a number of principles that they felt jurisdictions around the world should be following as they thought about responding to the crisis of the pandemic and also kind of building back from COVID-19. And it was really an attempt to say, we need to be thinking about this kind of forced pause in many of our social and economic systems as a moment where we have a window to create, to co-create a better, more just future. About 500 organizations internationally signed on to those principles. And then we in Canada started a conversation about how we could bring those principles home. This conversation started with a call that had close to 200 individuals representing organizations across the spectrum of civil society in Canada. And we spent about 6 weeks together developing these principles jointly and released them on May 25th. So I'd like to just quickly walk through the principles with you, tell you a little bit more about how they came together. And then I'm really excited to hear from Natalie and Maya, who of course, we're deeply involved in putting these principles together in the Canadian context as well, about what these principles have kind of meant for some of the campaigns that have unfolded since we launched in late May. Okay, great. Apologies, there's always a bit of a lag with the slide control, but so as I said, these principles were developed with communities coming together across the country as those communities were responding to the immediate needs of people in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also thinking about the kinds of recommendations that could be made to governments and community leaders about the ways in which this pandemic has revealed a series of social and economic injustices that are really at the kind of bedrock of many of the systems that we function in. And as a moment that we needed to kind of respond to those vulnerabilities and change those systems so that we are addressing those systemic injustices, including injustices like climate change. And we at Climate Action Network Canada were very deeply involved in this process and helping to facilitate it. It is not a process that is owned by any one organization. At this point, there are over 550 organizations that have endorsed these principles and used them in a variety of contexts. Really, this was about creating a high-level platform where all these diverse people could come together, see their priorities reflected, and where we could declare as progressive civil society in Canada that we see the interlinkages between the siloed issues that we are all working on, and understand that, for instance, the struggle to confront climate change is one and the same with the struggle to confront systemic racism, colonial processes that are extractive in Indigenous communities, Black communities of color in particular. And so it was an attempt to kind of articulate these interlinkages and really demand that governments, as they were creating investments and policies to respond to the pandemic and to think about what came next, we're also understanding that this call for transformative change. And you've heard this word transformative now come up in a few of our profiles. This is really the systemic level change that we're looking for. Of course, and I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of a preview into how the principles are articulated. I'm not going to read through each of those slides. They're easily found. All these words are easily found online. But really, this is about kind of standing on the threshold of the world that we have lived in over the course of the last number of decades and centuries, and saying we are on this threshold, and it is up to us to come together to build the future that we want to see and want to live in, a future that is caring for ourselves and for our communities and for the planet. The principles, as I said, were launched on May 25th. That was the same day that George Floyd was killed in the United States. We very quickly were exposed to the ways in which we didn't get everything right with these principles. They're not the be all and end all. We didn't capture everything. And one of the things we missed, for instance, was really naming systemic racism, naming anti-Black racism. We also, missed the boat when it comes to really naming the fact that these are feminist principles, that many of the organizations that came to these principles are working through a feminist lens and really center feminist priorities in their work. So important to name that we didn't get it perfectly, but there has been a lot of openness within the Just Recovery movement to adjusting and responding to these gaps in the principles as they've come up. So you'll find on the website, for instance, a webinar that was hosted through Just Recovery to talk about the links between Just Recovery and anti-Black racism, along with a number of resources there to help us think through the connections between different issues and injustices. So let's dive into the principles. We had some amazing artwork done to bring the principles to life. You can again download all of this artwork, including a coloring book, on the website. It's really beautiful work, and big shout out to the artists that we worked with on these visuals. Our first principle is to put people's health and well-being first, with no exceptions. This one really speaks for itself, but it is our attempt to say, it's time that we really think about investing in the kind of caring economy, a kind of caring community level support that we are really seeing transform people's experience of this pandemic. And to, instead of being in this kind of gig economy or this fast moving economy that we're in right now that really prioritizes growth and profit over people, we need to be shifting to that caring economy, really putting people at the center of our priorities. And this, of course, includes maintaining some of the increased support for access to public health and for essential services that we've seen throughout the pandemic, and saying this is something we have been doing all along, and something we really need to preserve and build on the heels of the pandemic. Our second principle is to strengthen the social safety net and provide relief directly to people. I think a big part of the fulcrum of this principle is to say, you know, we see a lot of the time governments responding to these kinds of crises by funneling money into private sector interests. And part of the vulnerabilities, part of the injustice we are being confronted with through this pandemic is the fact that that doesn't work. It doesn't work to prioritize profit over people. And so we should be investing in people directly. We also need to be prioritizing the needs of workers and communities. And this in particular is a response to the fact that we saw throughout the pandemic, private sector actors, particularly in places like the fossil fuel sector, taking advantage of this as an opportunity to ask for all kinds of unqualified bailouts, increases to inefficient subsidies, the rollback of environmental and social regulations that are meant to be there to protect people and the planet. And it was a really opportunistic moment, a reflection of something that we saw in the 2008 financial crisis. And so what this principle is about saying, hey, let's put all of that noise aside. Governments cannot be bending to the will of these private sector actors, cannot be taking, you know, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers demands to eliminate about 100 regulations that protect people and the environment in Canada and responding to them in kind as if that's going to be what saves us. This is about actually really centering workers and communities and building resilience in the Canadian workforce and in those communities to help protect us against future crises. And of course, on that note, the fourth principle is to build resilience to prevent future crises. And this is a big part of this is a big principle where a lot of the articulation around what we're expecting in terms of protecting the planet comes into play. So we need to be making sure that recovery plans move us toward a diversified economy and systems that reduce social and economic inequalities that I've mentioned so far. And the point here, of course, is, you know, we know that future crises are coming, right? We're still in the midst of the climate crisis. Climate impacts continue to rage in Canada and other places around the world. And so if we are seeing these vulnerabilities, then we need to be responding to them by building resilience so that we are more flexible, we are more ready to respond to those future crises. There are two more that I'll go through. Build solidarity and equity across communities, generations, and borders. It's not just about what Canada does here at home. It's also about how we make sure that these principles are upheld in other jurisdictions around the world. And we here in Canada have the moral responsibility and also the resources to ensure that we are modeling and encouraging and supporting these kinds of transformative and progressive actions in other places around the world, in particular, avoiding this trend toward protectionism and austerity and trying to safeguard against that, not just within Canada, but globally. And finally, and this was, so the international principles that I mentioned that we took inspiration from had 5 principles, and we added a 6th in Canada. And of course, that 6th principle is to uphold Indigenous rights and work in partnership with Indigenous peoples. This was another place where we didn't get everything exactly right. However, we are really fortunate to have Indigenous colleagues and organizations who work with and serve Indigenous communities come together to articulate this principle. And what I see in this principle is, again, you know, acknowledging the fact that Indigenous communities are really on the forefront of leadership when it comes to addressing so many of the systemic injustices and inequalities that we see, including things like climate change. And we need to be looking to those communities taking their leadership and figuring out ways in which we can support that leadership with the right investments and by withdrawing, in many instances, colonial government priorities in those communities. So I will leave it at that. It was a really whirlwind overview of the principles. Thanks so much to those who have been sharing links in the chat, and really thrilled to be here with Natalie and Maya, and to talk a little bit about all of the incredible campaigns that have kicked off using some of the Just Recovery principles as a starting point.
You want me to launch right into things, Elle, or?
Thank you. Sorry, my mute function took a while to unmute. Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine. That was fantastic. And thanks again to everyone for sharing all those links and connecting. Yes, we're going to hand it over to Natalie. You can launch right in to talking about some more practical ways of how the principles are being applied.
Great, thank you. And I'm also joining you from the unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territories, also known as Ottawa. And I'm happy to be here with everyone. Thanks to Tamarack for hosting this great discussion. I was really excited to be part of the Just Recovery for All principles. And what gets me so excited about that is the kind of cross-sectoral collaboration that Kat was talking about earlier. And I'm going to share a little bit about some work that we do at Citizens for Public Justice through a coalition called Dignity for All, which we help co-lead with Canada Without Poverty and Campaign 2000. And I'm going to be speaking specifically about our Chew on This campaign and how this is one example of the ways that we can apply these principles of a just recovery. So what got me so excited about the principles of a just recovery and this ability to work across sectors is that I really felt last fall, for example, when I participated in the climate marches and I looked around at all the people pouring into the streets and showing their support, and I just thought, as an anti-poverty advocate, I thought, you know, I bet all these people also care about poverty in Canada. And how can we work together to show that the things that we are calling for, the things we're asking for, are not competing interests, but they're actually all part of the same foundation, the same core values and goals that we need. So being able to work with such a variety of groups and people on developing the principles of a just recovery was really great to just affirm the common ground that we have, and to affirm also that it really comes down to putting people first, basing everything on principles of equity, anti-oppression, and sustainability, and that those go together, that they can't be separated apart. With our Chew on This campaign and our work with Dignity for All, we've always adopted a human rights framing of poverty. So we've always talked about poverty not as an issue of charity, but an issue of justice. So the campaign has always been really grounded in human rights, and we're increasingly trying to apply a much more intersectional anti-oppressive lens specifically to our work, and better understanding what it means for us to practice allyship and walk in solidarity with people in communities experiencing systemic oppression who are most disproportionately affected by poverty, and the kinds of policies that we're advocating for in our campaigns. So as you can see on this slide here, we believe that poverty is fundamentally a violation of people's rights and dignity. It is pervasive and systemic, but it is not inevitable. And so we feel that the same solutions to tackling poverty really are the same solutions at their core to addressing climate change and addressing colonialism, addressing anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism that we saw a lot through COVID. And so this has been a venture this year to really put those principles of a just recovery into practice, and to work with a variety of groups. We have a series of webinars that looks at quite a few different issues related to poverty, including climate and poverty, or later this afternoon we have a webinar looking at equitable and sustainable jobs and their role in addressing poverty. So it's been a really neat way to take some of the relationships that were formed through the development of the principles of a just recovery, and to continue working together, continue amplifying one another's work, and continue pressing forward for this rights-based approach to tackling these issues, and really highlighting this undercurrent of systemic oppression that is at play. So our campaign this year focuses on several asks. So typically this campaign has been calling for a national plan to end poverty in Canada that is based in human rights and that is comprehensive in nature. That is, that it addresses housing, food security, health, childcare, a variety of issues. This year we pivoted a little bit because in 2018 the federal government did release a poverty reduction strategy. It certainly wasn't the one we recommended or that we asked for, but rather than continue to ask for changes to that plan or, oh, can you fix this, we decided to really return to our roots of the human rights and this pervasive systemic oppression that causes and perpetuates poverty. So the asks this year were developed in consultation with a number of groups and organizations. And again, we were really looking to identify some specific asks that resonated with the people who are most affected by these policy decisions. So people with lived experience of poverty and other intersecting forms of systemic oppression. So this year, what we are calling on the federal government to do is to fulfill their legal obligations to protect people's rights to an adequate standard of living and commit to ending poverty in Canada by 2030. So this would be consistent with human rights and sustainable development goals that Canada has already signed on to, that they've already ratified and committed to fulfilling. So we're basically just saying, you know, do what you already said you would do. To do that, we recognize that we need to have specific targets set to end poverty and improve measures of well-being and equity among communities experiencing systemic oppression. So having our national poverty line is important, but it can really mask what is happening underneath. So when we look at more disaggregated data and we look at the rates of poverty, for example, for First Nations, Inuit and Métis people, when we look about incidents of poverty among racialized groups, among LGBTQ people, people with living disabilities, for example, the rates skyrocket. So we know that poverty doesn't affect all people equally. And so we want to make sure that if we're going to tackle poverty and if we're going to set a goal of ending poverty, we need to make sure that our solutions are actually having an impact on these equity-seeking groups and make sure that we're closing the gap in terms of their health outcomes, their wellness, their economic power, for example. So we've asked for specific targets to be set in consultation with these groups. So these are kind of the highlights of the asks. If you visit our website, which is just chewonthis.ca or Morsa in French, you can see a little bit more detail for each of these asks. But again, we're asking for the targets to be set in collaboration and consultation with these communities themselves, and to ensure that they, at minimum, meet the existing international human rights standards we'd agree to, ensuring that at minimum they meet the requirements of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So once we've set those targets, we want to make sure that our budgets prioritize funding for strategies that actually reduce poverty and improve the measures of well-being and equity among these communities. So to do that, we need disaggregated data. To do that, we need meaningful consultation and accountability. We need publicly funded universal programs like pharmacare, like universal childcare, and other such programs, but we also need community level strategies that are developed by communities for communities. So we need to make sure that there's this meaningful consultation and accountability happening throughout the process. So again, this has to do with developing the solutions, but it also has to do with existing programs. If our tax system currently, for example, does not do an adequate job of redistributing wealth and power in our country, then it needs to be changed. And we know it doesn't. So for example, when we talk about prioritizing funding for strategies, we don't just mean adding additional strategies, but let's scrap the ones that aren't working. Let's make sure that we're understanding the impact of those existing policies. And that's, again, not just programs and services, but that's laws, that's looking at, for example, the non-recognition of foreign credentials, which is a huge barrier for people. It's looking at how do we make sure that people are actually receiving the benefits that we've already budgeted for. So for example, many people with precarious immigration status aren't able to access things like the child benefit. People that pay into the tax system don't actually receive the benefits that already exist. And then in addition, there are many people that are outside the tax system that are not receiving the benefits for which they're eligible. So we need to look at the actual impact of our proposed solutions and policies on the people that are most disproportionately affected by them. So there's all kinds of further details that we could get into, and there's examples of specific strategies, but these are sort of our high-level asks. And I think you'll find that there's quite a bit of resonance with the principles of a just recovery in terms of putting people and their well-being first, making sure that that help goes directly to people in their communities, making sure that we're honoring Indigenous rights and sovereignty. So this, again, is one application of the principles of a just recovery. And although it's not explicitly stated in these asks, when we tease this out and when we have our webinars on different topics, for example, we look at how sustainability plays into this as well. So when we're talking about strategies that reduce poverty, for example, you know, all too often as anti-poverty advocates, we hear, well, if people want to get out of poverty, they just need to get a job. Well, what kinds of jobs? So for example, we're having a webinar that looks at equitable and sustainable jobs and how do we support workers as we transition to a green economy. So there's all kinds of overlapping considerations, but these are sort of the core principles. And so to animate these asks, we have a few different ways you can take action. So we have a letter template that you can send to your MP. It's available in English, French, and Inuktitut. We have both an online form that you can use on the website to send the letter, or you can download it, you can print it. We recognize that many people living in poverty don't have access to digital technology or internet. So if you're within that community or working with that community, we have options for you to print off the letter and send it in with no postage required when you're sending to the House of Commons. We have an e-rally coming up this Saturday that we would love to have flooded with people, and I know that there will be government representatives on the call as well. So it's a great way to show support, and that will include also a collective social action, social media action, I should say. We have a tool to write a letter to the editor of your local papers, and again, there's a template there. You put in your postal code, it identifies the 5 nearest papers. And then if you can just help us spread the word, we'd love for you to follow us on Twitter, use the hashtag #ChewOnThis, visit the website. And again, we believe that there are just so many people out there that, that share our commitment to these goals and values. And we want to make sure that our government knows just how many of us there are. So I want to thank you for your time and this opportunity. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Natalie. Thanks very much for sharing the Chew on This campaign information. And the links have been shared in the chat box as well. We will follow up with some links for this for everyone. And we will hand it over now to Maya from the LEAP.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that, Natalie and Kat. It's so nice to be on this panel with you all. So nice not to be on a manel, one of my favorite terms that's come out of the early pandemic days, an all-male panel. Entirely refreshing. So my name is Maya. I'm the Senior Manager of Programming and Development at the LEAP. And I'm usually based in Toronto, but right now I am in Kjipuktuk, Mi'kmaq, also known as so-called Halifax in Nova Scotia. And I was so amazed and in wonder as these Just Recovery principles started coming out. And I really love, Kat noted really carefully the ways in which you know, we got a lot wrong and missed a lot of things, and how what an incredible moment it was for people who have worked in civil society and climate organizations in this country to be able to hold all of that nuance, and to be able to really think through ways that we need to challenge the ways we operate organizationally and in the world. And so my colleagues were much more involved in the just recovery principle writing. And so I just want to shout out and acknowledge that, because I was working on a different project that we were doing at the LEAP. Similarly to many other environmental organizations at the beginning of the pandemic, we were all in a scramble about how we could pivot the work we had been doing for so long to become much more relevant in this moment, but also recognizing that something the Just Recovery Principles really outline are the ways the door had been kicked open on helping the public really grasp what is possible if we go big, really big, for the full picture, and just define the starting point as no one gets left behind, period, as opposed to fighting for what we had been conditioned to believe was possible to win. Because I think something that is becoming very clear is that everything is on the table, and what we need to do is help make what is possible real for people. And if you've seen, kind of for a long time, we've had big, bold calls to action. We want to end white supremacy. We want to end fascism. We want to end racism. And not a lot of ways for people to tangibly understand how we do that. And the Just Recovery Principles offered a guiding starting point about what we should be asking for. And at the LEAP, what we try to do is bring those stories to life in ways that can make sense for people. So something that we were working on at the beginning of the pandemic, or just before the pandemic actually, was we had released a video with one of our co-founders at the LEAP, Avi Lewis, and Naomi Klein had done a video with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on what it would look like if we actually fully brought into life all of the components of a Green New Deal. And I encourage you to go watch that video, or you can look it up on YouTube. You can also go to the LEAP website and find it. But that was a really beautiful way for us to start thinking about what is possible if we actually enacted policies in communities and carried them out all the way. And so we decided to take that one step further as the pandemic hit full swing. And we launched a project called the Peoples Bailout, which you can find at peoplesbailout.ca. And what we were trying to do was really keep an eye. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of conversations around mutual aid. And I think that mutual aid got really warped as we lost sight, and as in the absence of, at that moment, things like the Just Recovery Principles. Because mutual aid is not about charity. Mutual aid is not about creating stopgap measures that give handouts to people. Mutual aid is about helping communities help each other to fill in the gaps where we're not getting the support that we need. But mutual aid and its radical roots in disability justice always encourage us to keep an eye on systemic changes and to fundamentally look at how we can shift, break down, and remake new systems that actually see to everybody's needs. And so we were trying to keep those principles of mutual aid really close when we thought about the ways that we could explain to the public what is possible if we decide to leave nobody behind, fundamentally. And for us, that meant talking about like how we got in this mess in the first place. Why do we have billionaires? What purpose do they serve? Why do people not have water? Is it because we're running out of water, or is it because there are people poisoning the water? Why are people living in dangerous conditions? Is it because they just didn't work hard enough and just couldn't get the help that they need? Or is it because that there is a group of people who are financially invested and benefiting from dispossessing and disenfranchising people? And that is the way that racism and white supremacy and real life fascism come back from the dead are playing out in our communities and in our political spectrum right now. And so we decided to launch the People's Bailout because we wanted people to see what could happen if we decided to get rid of billionaires, create a massive wealth tax, tax the heck out of people who had been profiting off of poverty, off of racism for decades upon decades, and actually redistribute those funds into real life programs that have an impact on people's lives. So we rolled out the People's Bailout in a first initial couple buckets. We called them buckets. The first was housing, and then healthcare, work, food. We just released one on transit, and we divided them into three kind of pillars or steps, if you will. The first was relief, that people need relief right now where they are. And that involved things like canceling rent, a mortgage and rent moratorium, a complete ban on evictions, no back rent that people would have to pay, immediate access to full healthcare, free of barriers, regardless of your status, regardless of your socioeconomic positioning, things like this. And those were things that people needed right now to survive, relief. The second major step was recover. We needed to actually create policies and facilitate calls to action that laid the groundwork for us to overthrow that system eventually. But to create a roadmap where people are continuing to get immediate support where they are right now, with the final pillar being reimagine. Why do we have the society that we have, and is it working for us? And if it's not working for us, maybe we need a new system. And here are some proposals that we could have moving forward. And so right now with the People's Bailout, we're trying to think about ways that we can bring storytelling of what's possible back into people's lives. So we just released a new video called Message from the Future 2. Decided to stick with the name, where we talked about what is happening in the pandemic right now, and what is going to happen as climate change starts to hit and continues to hit across the world. We need to create policies that are planning for climate catastrophe because it is already happening, but fundamentally that attack the systems that are getting us there in the first place. And so we're working on a couple different projects that are in tandem with that. The first project is we are working with our partners, an organization called War on Want in the UK, on a global Green New Deal policy framework. You can follow that online at Global Green New Deal. And that is going to be about actually attacking every working area of how our world works and instead offering a different solution about what it could look like. So we're working with activists, organizers, journalists, academics, scientists, mobilizers, policy analysts, some government representatives in trying to craft buckets of work from how the global economy works to important aspects of shifting our global economy, like debt and reparations, like prison abolition, like food sovereignty and food justice, land back, these really core parts of what must be part of a just recovery. And you can look that up online and follow. We're going to be releasing a lot of webinars and online digital work, but eventually we will also be releasing a really comprehensive document that will have detailed policy recommendations and calls to action on a global scale. And the last thing that I'll say is, because I'll try and keep it short so we can get to our bigger part of our discussion here, is that what we're calling for right now at the LEAP and the kind of focus that we're trying to take with our work, as many others are, is that fundamentally care work is climate work, and care work is how we're going to claw ourselves out of the worst parts of this pandemic while actually addressing a lot of these systemic issues at the root. So one of our founders, Naomi Klein, has been talking about this for a very long time, which is that care work is low carbon work. It is green transition work. It is often gendered, often undervalued, and needs valorizing. It needs uplifting, and fundamentally it needs a lot more money. And if we defund or we completely get rid of all fossil fuel subsidies and we have an intensive wealth tax, we can actually fund programs that meet people where they are. So care work is things like healthcare, education, childcare, personal support work, everybody who is involved in caring for each other. This is low carbon work. And this is incredibly undervalued. It's important to watch and to really think about the ways we flipped suddenly from applauding teachers for doing everything that they can to keep their classrooms safe, to basically forcing people to go into crowded classrooms with very little support, with very little backup, with very little PPE. And so these are the ways that capital is playing out in all these dangerous ways. And if we, instead of funding all of the worst parts of our society, we funded all of these really wonderful parts of it, we could actually fund a transition plan that supported communities in the ways that they need to be supported, and they must be supported if we're going to survive. And also talks about the ways that we deserve to thrive. I think that that's something that the Just Recovery Principles really highlight in a very beautiful way, is that we don't actually deserve just to survive. We deserve to thrive, and people deserve to thrive. And so you don't just deserve to be put in a cinder block house if you need housing. You deserve to be in a beautiful house that's lovingly detailed by people who have unionized jobs, who are paid good wages. You deserve not to be terrified about losing your housing or have to pay for housing instead of healthcare. You shouldn't be afraid to leave your house because the police are murdering people that look like you. And you shouldn't be afraid to go to a hospital because people could possibly murder you because of racism, as we saw with the killing of Joyce Ekwon in Montreal, as we saw with the recent murder of Anthony Ost in Ottawa, who fell 12 stories after an interaction with police. These are things that need to be challenged from a climate lens if we plan on building the world that we deserve to thrive in. And so if you're looking to keep, I'll kind of stop there. If you're looking to follow up with more work about the People's Bailout or the Global Green New Deal, you can visit the LEAP's website. You can also watch the second installment of Message from the Future on our website as well. And I definitely encourage you to. It's a very uplifting video and a call to action that touches on a lot of the intersecting places for justice that we're going to have to battle it out in the coming weeks and months as we enter the second wave of COVID. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks for your thoughts, and I can see the chat box very active in response to a lot of your comments and what you're sharing. So thanks to everyone for that. I'm going to hand it over to Anjum, who has some questions, and we'll try to dig into some kind of deeper dialogue and discussion. Over to you, Anjum.
Thanks so much. And I must say, every time I listen to each of you speak, I learned so much. So thank you for the rich discussion and the rich presentation. So I'm calling in today from Toronto, also known as Takaranto, which is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and also most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And now is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So first, I want to start off with Catherine. Thank you so much for describing the Just Recovery framework and principles. And I think what the principles really highlighted to me, one of the takeaways is how all of these movements, whether it's focusing on advancing racial justice, gender equality, climate change, workers' rights, health equity, and many other social movements, they're all interconnected. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to perhaps one challenge around bringing diverse environmental, economic, and social movements together, and how do we take principles into action? We saw two great examples or two case studies of those action-oriented pieces, but anything you'd like to share there?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Anjum. And thanks to Natalie and Maya for your amazing presentations. It's just like always so nourishing to hear about the incredible work that's happening. So a couple of things that have kind of come to me over the course of the last number of months as we've been doing this work a little bit. The Canadian environmental movement, and this is true for environmental movements in other parts of the world as well, really doesn't look a whole lot like the communities that it works with and in. It is traditionally a very white settler dominated movement that is changing. Thank goodness, but for that to change, we have to change. Those of us who are the members of the environmental movement in Canada have to change. And that can be uncomfortable, right? So we have this kind of progressive shield that we tend to put up where we're like, no, we're on the right side of things. We're not racist, we're not sexist. We don't need to deal with any of those things. And it might be true that we all come into this work with very good intentions, but we also come into this work with a whole series of socialized constructs that we live within, with the realities of the systemic racism that often operate right under our noses without us being able to see it, and that we are often complicit in without acknowledging it. So the first step really is like being able to be present for those challenging conversations. To I love to share this quote from one of my mentors, Adrienne Marie Brown. She says, acknowledge intent, attend to impact. Acknowledge the fact that we have good intentions, acknowledge, but also attend to the impact that we sometimes make when we are coming into these spaces, particularly if we're white or white passing settler people. Acknowledge the fact that the environmental movement has done harm in the past, and be able to sit with that and talk about it openly and figure out how to move on, or how to like work with others in a good way, and how to deal, I think I've made that point. And then the other, I think, really important message that I've really tried to internalize is the environmental movement in particular tends to move forward with a lot of urgency, a lot of speed, and that's understandable. We're all dealing with crises that we really feel the pressure of. We want to be doing something always. We're all overachievers. But when it comes to building relationships across communities, across issue silos, it takes time. And in order to actually be building those relationships of trust from which transformational change come, that's always where change comes from, is relationships of trust. Then we need to actually, as I've heard lots of really brilliant people, including Ariel Deranger of Indigenous Climate Action, say, we have to move at the speed of trust. We have to be able to invest in that relationship building, and know that maybe it's not going to take the time, it's not going to work on the timeline we've established. But if we are going to actually be in those relationships in a way that's not extractive, that's not about, just kind of getting someone to sign on to our petition or join our rally, then we need to be able to slow down a little bit and take the time that it needs.
That's great. And I think especially around working with communities and seeing what is resonating, seeing if actually what you're saying has an impact, and making that vision real. Kind of moving to Natalie, one of the things I noticed is how you integrated human rights instruments, and you talked a lot about, the campaign is also saying, Canada, you already signed up for many of these declarations or statements or positions. Now it's time to act. I'm wondering, using the human rights or rights-based lens, how has that worked? And any lessons that you can share from application of that, in addition to the just recovery principles?
There we go. I think that the real benefit is that, again, as you've mentioned, it's an existing legal framework. So it's already out there. They've already agreed to it. So this is a question of accountability. And so it's been an effective framing for us in that sense. But the challenge, of course, is that saying that someone has a right to something is only as meaningful, only as impactful as their ability to claim that right. So, for example, if we say that, for example, Canada recognized housing as a human right in the National Housing Strategy, if there's no way for people to actually claim that right, then it's meaningless. So, so it has helped shape some of our asks and some of the questions that we're asking about, well, what does meaningful consultation, what does meaningful accountability look like in practice? And that's something, again, that has come out of our conversations and relationships with people experiencing poverty and with people experiencing other intersecting forms of systemic oppression, who are the most affected by these policies, but the least likely to have access to the conversations and decision-making process about them. So I think by grounding our work in a human rights framework, as I mentioned earlier, it helps us find that common ground across sectors, because we're really saying, okay, this comes down to the rights and dignity of all people. And again, that includes Indigenous rights and sovereignty. It includes international human rights. So it helps us kind of find that common ground among advocates, but it also gives us a bit of common ground in terms of government relations when we say, okay, you've already agreed to this, so how can we make this happen? So again, the big question and what we are calling government to do is to work in consultation and in collaboration with the people most affected to make sure that that there are these accountability mechanisms built in. Too often there's a program or a policy that's put in place, and then there's no disaggregated data to check on how it's actually playing out for people in the north or living on reserve. Our own official poverty line for Canada, the market basket measure, is not available for people living in the territories or on reserves. That's ludicrous. So we use other measures, we use other indicators, all of which tend to be underestimates, but we're looking together for the indicators, for the mechanisms that actually make these rights a lived reality for people. So yeah, it's been useful in that sense, but again, to make it meaningful, we need a way to claim it.
Thanks so much. And I think especially that piece around enforcement, it's one thing to have it and people kind of acknowledge it, but another for people to actually exercise that right. You know, earlier today, Catherine spoke about that we're on a precipice, and Natalie, you spoke about the importance of actually seeing real change in people's lives, their quality of life. I'm wondering, Maya, what I wanted to ask you was, it seems like we're at this critical moment. There is this energizing political will that's built up. There's this momentum, but it can wane, right? We're 6-7 months into a pandemic, or at least in Canada, since many places perhaps shifted. What do we need to do next? And is there a pivot that we need to do in our strategy as progressives? And I'm wondering if you could tell us what we haven't tapped into that we should be tapping into.
Thanks so much for that question, Anjem. Yeah, it seems like we are at like a pretty big precipice. That it's truly amazing to see. There are social movements sweeping across the world right now. There are full-blown revolutions happening in different countries. And I think that speaks to how tired people are of what is happening. Something I like to really hold on to closely is that something we know is that policy wins are the final step and the cementing of wins that happened in the streets. Like policy changes cement the wins of movements that start in the streets, that have changed the conversation about what needs to happen and how it needs to happen. And I go back to that disability justice principle, which is nothing for us without us. And I think that that's something that's actually like a tactical change that we need to have more focus on. And I think we're trying really hard to have more of a focus on. And you can see that in the way the work is happening right now. But for example, when we're talking about a wealth tax, or we're talking about how we redistribute wealth, I think we need to think about how we're channeling people into resistance struggles that are happening right now, so that people really start to understand what we mean when we say defund this and fund this instead. So something that's happening right now that I'm thinking about a lot is that there's a huge Loblaw strike happening right now with workers at over 11 different chains, for example, in Newfoundland. And something I think about a lot is that Canada's as CCPA releases a report in September saying that Canada's 20 top billionaires raked in about $2 billion each in the first 6 months of the worst economic catastrophe in Canadian history, to the tune of about $37 billion. And yet most grocery store workers make less than minimum wage or just barely minimum wage, and most of them work part-time. So they don't have any type of benefits, they don't have any types of supports, and yet these are the folks keeping us alive, literally and metaphorically as well. What kind of a society are we that we're upholding that? And what kind of principles are we upholding if we're not fighting for those workers? And is not working in providing food and safety for families low carbon climate work? So I think that we need to really think about how we draw these connections and help the public see where those connections are. Something that we're encouraged to do at my workplace, for example, is if there is a protest happening in the street, if someone who has been murdered by police, someone who has been murdered by our healthcare system, by neglect, or if someone is being evicted from their home unlawfully, because there is supposedly a ban on evictions, but housing advocates have been ringing the bell on this since the beginning of the pandemic. We know that evictions are still happening, and we know that the police are carrying them out. If any of those things are happening, my boss encourages me to go to them, because that is the work. And to think about what I've learned there and bring that back into the work that I'm doing here. And I think that we're seeing a lot of climate organizers start to keep those lenses about them and bring that work into other places that they're doing it. But I think that that's something progressives really need to hold on to. There is that famous MLK quote that everybody is always churning out when Martin Luther King Day comes out, and everyone goes, he was just a nice guy who didn't want to have violence. And you realize that Martin Luther King was a radical revolutionary who encouraged activism and action in the streets. Is that, you know, being a pacifist in moments like this and being more invested in maintaining, air quotations, peace. Sorry, I'm holding a stress ball. It's something I picked up during the pandemic. I just hold it all the time. Upholding the status quo means, you know, keeping this calm response to violence that is happening, and we should not be calm, and progressives should not sit back and try and look at the sunny side, and we should not think that everything's going to be okay, because everything will not be okay if we don't do something about it. And so we actually need to support radical movements that are happening in the street. We actually need to, when we say we want housing for all, if people are being evicted, we should be at our neighbors' houses, making sure that they are not evicted. If we believe in Indigenous rights, and we say that we believe in Indigenous rights, then if you're in Mi'kmaq or Halifax, Nova Scotia, you should be on the wharf in Digby, where Indigenous fishermen are fighting off white supremacist militias as they're trying to fish for lobster. Or you should be at Landback Lane in Caledonia, where Haudenosaunee land defenders are being kicked off their land and arrested by the RCMP. Or you should be with the Tiny House Warriors, where the Trans Mountain Pipeline construction may be happening soon, and police have been arresting Indigenous land defenders. And if you believe that we need to defund and disarm and dismantle and abolish the police, when the police are harming Black people and Indigenous people in this country, you should be out in the streets with Black community and Indigenous community, fighting police brutality. These are the things that we need to be doing. So the thing that I always get stuck on when I think about what progressives should be doing is actually going out there and making it true. And then coming back and thinking about, how does this fit into the work that I'm doing? And am I actually living through the principles that I've been talking about this entire time? And how can I make that real, not only in the world that we are building, but the world that we're living right now, and the different worlds that other people are living based on their social location. Yeah.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And, you know, there's a couple questions that were coming up. I think we have about 1 or 2 minutes left. So maybe very quickly, maybe in 10 seconds, if you can, one thing that people should take away as we move forward in this work. So maybe I'll go Maya first quickly, and then Natalie, and then Catherine, and then over to the wrap up.
Can you say that question again one more time?
What is one lesson, or actually, let me switch it very quickly. What is the biggest surprise that you had during this pandemic organizing that we can all take away?
I think the biggest surprise that I had was that I thought, I didn't realize how scared and then not scared people would be to get back into organizing work. I think that I was really nervous about what it would mean to do community work in the midst of a pandemic. And then I realized that we can absolutely continue to do community work while keeping people safe. Something that blew me away was being on the street after Regis Korchinski-Paquette was murdered by Toronto police at her home in Roncesvalles in Toronto. We had 10,000 people show up in the street with barely a day notice. And made a very strong statement about what we were going to stand and not stand for as a community. And so I think something that's taken me quite off guard is how actually still powerful we are. And in fact, we're more powerful now because people's material lives have changed so much that people see actually what's at stake. Well, that's something that has taken me entirely by surprise in a really good way in this pandemic.
Thank you, Maya. Over to you, Natalie, and then Catherine, and we'll wrap up.
Mine's more of a personal reflection and maybe less surprise as like a learning. Kat already spoke a little bit to the need to slow down to work at the speed of trust. And so I guess what I've been learning through this process is how white supremacy shows up just in the way I do things and my like task and achievement orientation. And so learning to value the process and the way we go about doing things just as much as, you know, how many people send letters or how many people join an e-rally and things like that. And instead focusing on that broader picture of what relationships are we building, who are we accountable to, how are we keeping ourselves accountable, how are we doing that internal work so that we're learning, and by we, I really mean me, how am I learning to embody anti-oppression, allyship, and just recognize the way that white supremacy lives in me, and learning to see it and hear people speak to that and change it.
What Maya said. So like this point around supporting frontline movements, like yes to all of that. And then the thing I would add, again, not a surprise necessarily, but like a real like, oh, learning the levels of investment that we are seeing, the levels of money that we are seeing government shovel out the door right now. And the fact that we've been in the climate movement and other progressive movements, like scrambling for literal scraps for decades and not getting anything and being told there's not enough to go around. There's not enough to address climate change. There's not enough to give people's home. There's not enough to welcome new Canadians. There's not enough. And this like myth of scarcity that we've all been put in and that we've all been told to fear is total BS. Like that is the thing we need to take away from this moment. We have enough. We have enough to go around. We can take care of each other. Like, and we should be dedicating our resources to doing that.
That is a fantastic note to end on. So I'll pass it over. But thank you everyone for this incredibly rich conversation. And I've learned so much in this short time. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Anjum. Thank you, everyone. I just want to take a minute to thank all our speakers today, to thank Catherine, Natalie, and Maya for joining us, and Anjum for tucking in with some deeper questions. I think there's so much that can come out of this. I think we may have some this is kind of snowballing into some other ideas for some follow-up webinars and sessions we can do. There's a few questions that we might be following up with after as a follow-up. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone shortly with some of these links and further resources. I'd like to also share that we have some other webinars coming up. If you visit our events page, there's a couple of interesting webinars. One of them is called From For People to With People, Creating Equitable and Resilient Places. So that's coming up in November. And then we have another webinar, I believe, that might be coming up through Tamarack. And this is about, I think Cormac Russell was quoted in our chat box today as well. So we're gonna have Cormac Russell for a virtual workshop diving deeper in talking about asset-based community development. So that's coming up in December. So all this information and more on our events page on our website. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And you'll be hearing from us. Feel free to get in touch with me at any time if you have any follow-up questions as well. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to all our speakers today, and have a good day.